The morning sun cast long shadows across the Texas plains as Sarah Mitchell hung freshly washed clothes on the line behind her small wooden cabin. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pasture. Her husband Thomas had left before dawn to check the fence line on the eastern border of their modest ranch, promising to return by sunset. Sarah hummed softly as she worked, her calloused hands moving efficiently from basket to line. At 24, she had already weathered 3 harsh winters on the frontier, learning to find joy in simple moments like these. The white cotton dress fluttered in the breeze, and she smiled, thinking of how Thomas would compliment her appearance when he returned. The sound of approaching horses broke through her peaceful reverie. Sarah looked up, shielding her eyes against the bright morning sun. 3 riders emerged from the tree line, moving at a steady pace toward her homestead. Her heart began to race as she recognized the distinctive war paint and feathered headdresses of Comanche warriors. Fear coursed through her veins like ice water. She had heard the stories from neighboring settlers about raids and captures, whispered tales shared around dinner tables and at Sunday church gatherings. The nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away, and Thomas would not return for hours. Sarah dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran toward the cabin. Her boots kicked up small clouds of dust as she sprinted across the yard, her long brown hair streaming behind her. The wooden door seemed impossibly far away as the sound of hoofbeats grew louder and closer. She reached the porch just as the riders entered her yard. Sarah fumbled for the door handle with trembling fingers, but strong hands grabbed her shoulders before she could escape inside. She screamed, the sound echoing across the empty plains. But there was no one to hear her cries for help. The lead warrior, a tall man with piercing dark eyes and intricate tattoos covering his muscled chest, studied her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. He spoke in rapid Comanche to his companions, gesturing toward the cabin and then back at Sarah. Though she could not understand his words, his tone suggested he was giving orders. 2 of the warriors dismounted and began searching through the cabin, emerging with blankets, food supplies, and Thomas's hunting rifle. They worked efficiently, taking only what would be useful for travel. The 3rd warrior remained mounted, keeping watch on the surrounding area for any signs of approaching riders. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of an escape plan. The barn was 30 yards away, but the mounted warrior would easily catch her before she could reach it. The well was closer but offered no real protection. Her only hope was that Thomas might return early and see the smoke from their cooking fire, but that seemed unlikely. The leader bound her hands with strips of leather, his movements rough but not unnecessarily cruel. Sarah noticed a long scar running from his left temple to his jawline, evidence of some past battle or conflict. His eyes held a hardness that spoke of difficult decisions and harsh realities of frontier life. As they prepared to leave, Sarah took what might be her last look at the little cabin she and Thomas had built together. The vegetable garden she had planted last spring was just beginning to show green shoots. The rocking chair Thomas had carved for their first anniversary sat empty on the porch. Everything that represented their dreams and their future was being left behind. The warriors lifted her onto one of their horses, securing her with additional rope around her waist. The animal was painted with symbols she did not recognize, and its rider wore a necklace of bear claws and polished stones. Sarah tried to memorize details of her captors, hoping that somehow this information might prove useful later. As they rode away from the homestead, Sarah twisted in the saddle to watch her home disappear behind a ridge. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she might never see Thomas again. The uncertainty of her fate filled her with a terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. The warriors rode in silence, following animal trails and creek beds that would make tracking difficult for any rescue party. Sarah's horse was led by a rope attached to the leader's mount, preventing any possibility of breaking away and fleeing. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they traveled deeper into territory she had never seen before. Hours passed without rest or water. Sarah's throat became dry and her lips began to crack under the relentless sun. Her captors seemed unaffected by the heat, maintaining their steady pace across the harsh landscape. Occasionally they would stop to examine tracks in the dirt or scan the horizon for signs of pursuit, but these pauses lasted only minutes. As afternoon approached, Sarah began to understand the gravity of her situation. She was being taken far from everything familiar, into a world where she did not speak the language or understand the customs. The realization that she might never return home settled over her like a heavy blanket, threatening to crush her spirit entirely. The Comanche camp appeared like a mirage in the late afternoon heat, with dozens of buffalo hide teepees arranged in a large circle around a central fire pit. Smoke rose from several cooking fires, and the sound of children playing mixed with the barking of camp dogs and the neighing of horses in nearby corrals. Sarah's arrival caused an immediate stir among the camp residents. Women emerged from their dwellings to stare at the pale-skinned captive, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Children ran alongside the horses, chattering excitedly in their native tongue. Some threw small stones and sticks, while others simply pointed and laughed at her strange clothing and appearance. The leader, whom Sarah heard others call Kicking Bear, dismounted near the largest teepee and spoke with an elderly woman whose face was marked with intricate tattoos. The woman nodded gravely as she listened, occasionally glancing at Sarah with calculating eyes. Sarah sensed that her fate was being decided in words she could not understand. Kicking Bear untied Sarah from the horse and led her to a smaller teepee on the edge of the camp circle. The interior was dim and cramped, with buffalo robes spread on the ground and various tools and weapons hanging from the hide walls. A young Comanche woman sat in the corner, nursing an infant while two other small children played nearby. The woman looked up as they entered, and Sarah was startled to see that despite her native dress and darkened skin, her features suggested mixed heritage. When she spoke, it was in heavily accented but understandable English. "My name is Running Deer. I will teach you our ways so you may survive." Relief flooded through Sarah at hearing her own language. "Please, you must help me escape. My husband will be looking for me. He will pay whatever ransom they ask." Running Deer shook her head sadly. "There will be no ransom. You belong to Kicking Bear now. He lost his wife in a cavalry raid last winter. The spirits have brought you to replace what was taken from him." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She sank to her knees on the buffalo robe, finally understanding the true nature of her captivity. This was not a temporary situation that could be resolved with negotiation or payment. She was expected to become part of this world permanently. "I cannot do that," Sarah whispered. "I am married. I have a life, a home. Thomas will come for me." "Your old life is gone," Running Deer said firmly but not unkindly. "The sooner you accept this, the easier it will be. I was taken from a wagon train 7 years ago. I fought against my fate for months and suffered greatly for it. Only when I stopped fighting did I find peace." That evening, Sarah was brought to the central fire where the entire tribe had gathered for a meal. The smell of roasted meat made her stomach growl despite her emotional turmoil. She had not eaten since breakfast, and her body's needs were beginning to override her mental anguish. Kicking Bear gestured for her to sit beside him on a blanket spread near the fire. The other warriors and their families watched with interest as bowls of food were passed around the circle. Sarah hesitated, unsure of the proper etiquette and afraid of making a mistake that might anger her captors. An elderly man with white braids began to speak in Comanche, his voice carrying the authority of a leader or shaman. Though Sarah could not understand his words, his tone seemed ceremonial and important. Other members of the tribe nodded and murmured agreement as he continued his speech. When the old man finished speaking, Kicking Bear stood and pulled Sarah to her feet. He said something in Comanche that caused several people to laugh, though not in a mocking way. Running Deer, who sat nearby with her own family, translated quietly. "He says you are thin like a winter coyote and will need much food to become strong." Despite her fear and despair, Sarah felt a small spark of hope. The comment suggested that her captors intended to care for her, rather than simply use and discard her. Perhaps survival was possible if she could adapt to their ways while watching for opportunities to escape. The meal consisted of buffalo meat, wild onions, and a type of bread made from ground roots. Though the flavors were unfamiliar, the food was well prepared and nourishing. Sarah ate slowly, aware that all eyes were upon her and that her behavior was being judged. After the meal, the tribe settled in for storytelling and music. Drums began to beat in complex rhythms while several men sang in harmonious voices. The firelight danced across painted faces and decorated clothing, creating an almost magical atmosphere that Sarah might have found beautiful under different circumstances. Children curled up against their mothers as the evening grew cooler. Dogs settled down near the fire for warmth. The normal rhythms of family life continued around Sarah, as if her presence was already accepted as natural and expected. Kicking Bear led her back to his teepee as the fire burned low. Sarah's heart pounded as she realized what might be expected of her, but he simply pointed to a pile of buffalo robes arranged near the entrance. "Sleep," he said in broken English, one of the few words he seemed to know in her language. Sarah lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the camp settling down for the night. Through the teepee walls, she could hear conversations in Comanche, the crying of babies and the distant howling of coyotes on the plains. Every sound reminded her of how far she was from home and how unlikely rescue had become. She thought of Thomas discovering the ransacked cabin and following her trail to this place. But even if he could track them this far, what could one man do against an entire tribe of warriors? The realistic part of her mind knew that her husband was more likely to be killed than to successfully rescue her. As dawn approached, Sarah finally drifted into an exhausted sleep filled with dreams of her old life. She walked through her vegetable garden and sat in Thomas's handmade rocking chair, only to wake and find herself surrounded by buffalo hides and the smell of wood smoke instead of the familiar sense of home. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's capture, and she had begun to understand the daily rhythms of Comanche life. Each morning, she helped running deer gather wood and water while learning basic words in the native language. Her hands, once soft from domestic work, had developed new calluses from preparing buffalo hides and grinding corn. Kicking Bear had been patient with her, perhaps understanding that forced compliance would yield poor results. He brought her small gifts, a carved bone comb, a string of colored beads, a soft rabbit fur to keep her warm at night. These gestures confused Sarah, as they seemed to show genuine care rather than the indifference she expected from a captor. The other women in the tribe had gradually warmed to her presence, especially after she demonstrated her skill with needle and thread by mending torn clothing and repairing damaged moccasins. They began to include her in their daily tasks and conversations, though much of their chatter remained incomprehensible to her still developing language skills. Sarah had made 3 escape attempts during her first 2 weeks in the camp, each ending in swift recapture and gentle but firm correction. The vastness of the plains and her unfamiliarity with the terrain made successful flight nearly impossible. More importantly, she had begun to realize that the harsh landscape would likely kill her long before she could find her way back to civilization. On this particular morning, Sarah was helping to process a deer that hunters had brought in the previous evening. The work was bloody and difficult, requiring skills she had never learned as a settler's wife. An older woman named Singing Bird guided her hands as they separated meat from bone, showing her which parts were best for immediate eating and which should be dried for winter storage. The sound of approaching horses interrupted their work. A scouting party was returning to camp, and their urgent pace suggested important news. Sarah looked up from the butchering to see riders gesturing excitedly as they spoke with tribal leaders near the central fire. Running Deer moved closer to listen, then returned with a troubled expression. "Soldiers are coming," she told Sarah quietly. "Blue coats with guns and horses. They are still many miles away, but our scouts say they follow our trail." Sarah's heart leaped with hope. Perhaps Thomas had reached the nearest cavalry post and convinced them to mount a rescue mission. But Running Deer's worried face suggested that the approaching soldiers represented danger rather than salvation for everyone in the camp. "Will they attack?" Sarah asked, torn between hope for rescue and concern for the people who had shown her kindness despite her captive status. "Perhaps. They burned a village to the south last month, killed women and children as well as warriors. Our chief must decide whether to fight or move deeper into the desert where horses cannot easily follow." The camp erupted into organized activity as families began packing their most essential belongings. Teepees were quickly dismantled and loaded onto travois pulled by horses and dogs. Children were gathered close to their mothers while men checked weapons and prepared for the possibility of battle. Kicking Bear approached Sarah as she stood uncertainly amid the chaos. He spoke rapidly in Comanche, his tone urgent but not angry. Running Deer translated from nearby. "He says you must choose now. Stay with us and accept our protection, or try to reach the soldiers and risk being killed in the fighting that may come." The choice presented Sarah with an impossible dilemma. Escape had been her constant dream for 3 weeks, but now that opportunity seemed within reach, she hesitated. The soldiers might not distinguish between willing captives and adopted tribe members. In the confusion of battle, she could easily be shot by the very people who had come to rescue her. More troubling was her growing attachment to the people around her. Running Deer had become a friend and teacher. Singing Bird treated her like a favored daughter. Even Kicking Bear, despite being her captor, had shown her respect and consideration. The thought of their deaths or suffering caused her unexpected pain. "How long do we have?" Sarah asked. "The scouts say the soldiers will reach this area by tomorrow if they maintain their current pace. We must leave now if we hope to stay ahead of them." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to imagine the moment when cavalry soldiers would find her among the Comanche. Would they see a rescued victim or a woman who had chosen to live with the enemy? Would they believe her story or assume she had willingly collaborated with her captors? The image of Thomas filled her mind. By now he would be frantic with worry, searching every possible trail and questioning every traveler for news of her whereabouts. The thought of causing him such anguish was almost unbearable. Surely she owed it to him to take this chance for freedom, regardless of the risks involved. But as Sarah opened her eyes and looked around the camp, she saw families preparing to flee from their ancestral hunting grounds because of her presence among them. These people faced exile or death partly because they had chosen to accept her into their community, rather than simply killing her and moving on. Kicking Bear waited patiently for her decision, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. In his face, Sarah saw the same strength and dignity that Thomas possessed, though expressed through different cultural traditions. Both men had faced harsh frontier conditions with courage and determination. Both had shown her protection and care in their own ways. "I need time to think," Sarah said finally. Running Deer translated, and Kicking Bear nodded gravely. "He says you have until the sun reaches its highest point. Then we must go, with or without you." Sarah walked to the edge of the camp and sat on a large boulder, staring out at the endless expanse of grassland where her fate would soon be decided. In the distance, she could see dust clouds that might have been wind patterns or might have been the approaching cavalry. Either way, her old life and her new life were about to collide in ways she could not predict or control. The weight of choosing between two worlds pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Whatever decision she made would change her forever and affect the lives of everyone around her. Sarah had never felt so alone or so aware of how much power one person's choice could hold over the destinies of many. The sun reached its peak as Sarah made her decision. She would stay with the tribe and face whatever consequences followed. The thought of betraying people who had protected her, even as captors, felt worse than the uncertainty of remaining with them. Perhaps she could still find a way to contact Thomas later, when the immediate danger had passed. The Comanche moved swiftly across the plains, following ancient trails known only to their people. Sarah rode beside Running Deer, learning to balance on horseback while travois and pack animals raised clouds of dust around them. Children who had been laughing and playing hours earlier now rode in serious silence, understanding the gravity of their situation. By evening, they had covered nearly 30 miles, crossing 2 rivers and climbing into hill country, where trees provided better cover from pursuing eyes. The warriors who served as rear guards reported no signs of immediate pursuit, but everyone remained tense and alert as they made a cold camp without fires that might reveal their location. Sarah huddled under buffalo robes as the temperature dropped with nightfall. Her body ached from the long ride and her mind churned with doubts about her choice. What if the soldiers had brought word from Thomas? What if this was her only chance for rescue? The questions circled endlessly through her thoughts, offering no comfort or resolution. Kicking Bear approached her sleeping area carrying a bowl of cold meat and water. He sat beside her without speaking, his presence both protective and companionable. In the darkness, Sarah could barely make out his scarred profile, but she sensed his watchfulness as he scanned the surrounding hills for signs of danger. "Why did you choose to stay?" he asked suddenly in his broken English, surprising her with both his words and his willingness to speak her language. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "Because killing you would feel like killing part of myself now," she replied honestly. Kicking Bear was quiet for a long moment. "My wife spoke of such feelings before the soldiers came to our winter camp. She said the spirits had woven her heart into the hearts of our people, and breaking those threads would destroy something sacred." "What happened to her?" Sarah asked gently. "She tried to protect our children when the bluecoats attacked. A soldier's bullet found her heart." His voice carried old pain that time had not healed. "I have carried anger like a burning stone in my chest ever since. But anger does not bring back the dead or heal the wounds of the living. Sarah felt tears on her cheeks as she imagined Kicking Bear's loss. The similarity between his grief and Thomas's current anguish was not lost on her. Both men had lost the women they loved to forces beyond their control. Both faced uncertain futures without their chosen companions. "I am sorry for your pain," Sarah whispered, "and I am sorry that my presence brings danger to your people." "The danger was already here," Kicking Bear replied. "Your people and my people have been at war longer than either of us has been alive. You did not create this conflict, and you cannot end it by sacrificing yourself to it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a horse approaching through the darkness. One of the scouts had returned with news that caused immediate concern among the tribal leaders. Through whispered conversations and Running Deer's translation, Sarah learned that the cavalry had indeed been following their trail and was now camped less than 10 miles behind them. "They move faster than expected," Running Deer explained quietly. "Our chief thinks they have Indian guides helping them track us through the hills." The news sent a chill through Sarah's heart. If the soldiers were using native scouts, her chances of reaching them safely became even smaller. Such men would be familiar with Comanche tactics and would likely shoot first and ask questions later if they encountered anyone in the company of the tribe. Plans were quickly made to split the group into smaller parties that could scatter in different directions, making pursuit more difficult and reducing the risk to women and children. Sarah found herself assigned to a group of 6 people, including Kicking Bear, Running Deer, and an elderly medicine man named White Eagle. As they prepared to move again in the pre-dawn darkness, Sarah felt the weight of her decision settling permanently on her shoulders. There would be no going back now, no second chances to choose differently. She had cast her lot with these people, and their fate would be her fate whatever came next. The small group traveled through rough country where horses had to pick their way carefully between rocks and fallen trees. White Eagle led them along deer trails and forgotten paths that showed no signs of human passage. Sarah marveled at his ability to navigate through terrain that looked identical to her inexperienced eyes. By midday, they had climbed high enough into the mountains to see vast distances across the plains below. Through gaps in the trees, Sarah could make out tiny moving specks that might have been the cavalry patrol still following their trail. The sight filled her with conflicting emotions of fear and regret. "Do you think they will give up the chase?" she asked Running Deer as they rested beside a small stream. "Not if they are led by someone who has fought our people before. They know that allowing us to escape will encourage other tribes to resist their authority. They will pursue us until they can claim victory or until their supplies run out." That afternoon brought the sound they had all been dreading, the distant crack of rifle fire echoing through the valleys below. The main body of the tribe had apparently been located and engaged by the pursuing soldiers. The battle sounds continued for nearly an hour before fading into ominous silence. Sarah's heart ached as she imagined the suffering that confrontation had brought to both sides. Somewhere down in those valleys, people she had come to care about were dying or had already died. The knowledge that her capture had contributed to this violence filled her with guilt that threatened to overwhelm her remaining strength. Kicking Bear's face had become a mask of controlled fury as he listened to the sounds of battle. Sarah could see him struggling with the desire to ride back and join the fight against his enemies. Only his responsibility to protect the small group under his care seemed to hold him back from that course of action. As evening approached, they made another cold camp in a cave hidden behind a waterfall. The sound of falling water would mask any noise they might make, and the location was virtually invisible from more than a few yards away. But the isolation also meant they had no way of learning what had happened to their friends and family members in the valley below. 3 days passed in the hidden cave before White Eagle declared it safe to venture out and search for other survivors. The silence from the valleys below had been complete, suggesting that the battle was over and the soldiers had either claimed victory or withdrawn. Either possibility meant uncertainty about the fate of their people. Kicking Bear and White Eagle left at dawn to scout the surrounding area, leaving Sarah alone with Running Deer and her young children. The enforced isolation gave the women time to talk about their experiences and the choices that had brought them to this desperate situation. "I have been thinking about your husband," Running Deer said as she nursed her infant son. "He must be suffering greatly, not knowing whether you live or die. Such uncertainty can drive a man to madness or despair." Sarah nodded, her own guilt about Thomas's anguish growing stronger each day. "I tell myself that staying with the tribe was the right choice, but doubt eats at my heart like a hungry animal." What if I condemned him to a lifetime of searching and hoping for news that will never come? Perhaps there is another way to think about your situation, Running Deer suggested carefully. What if the spirits brought you to us not as a captive, but as a bridge between two peoples who have forgotten how to live in peace? The idea struck Sarah as both profound and naive. How could one person bridge a gap created by decades of warfare and mutual mistrust? The soldiers who had pursued them were not interested in peace negotiations with a white woman who had chosen to live among their enemies. Their conversation was interrupted by the return of the two men, who brought troubling news from their scouting expedition. The main tribal camp had been overrun and scattered, with many dead on both sides. Survivors had fled in all directions, making it impossible to locate and reunite the scattered families. What of the soldiers? Sarah asked through Running Deer's translation. Gone back to their fort, Kicking Bear replied grimly. But they took prisoners with them. Women and children who could not escape in time. The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought of Singing Bird and the other women who had shown her kindness, now facing an uncertain fate in military custody. The children she had watched play around the campfires were now separated from their families and thrust into an alien world they could not understand. We must follow them, Sarah said impulsively. Perhaps I can help negotiate for their release. As a white woman, they might listen to me where they would shoot other tribal representatives. Kicking Bear studied her face intently before responding. Such a journey would be very dangerous. The soldiers would be suspicious of any white woman who speaks for the Comanche. They might think you have become their enemy as well. But I have to try, Sarah insisted. These people protected me when they could have simply killed me. I owe them whatever help I can provide in return. White Eagle spoke in Comanche for several minutes, his tone suggesting careful consideration of the proposal. Kicking Bear nodded occasionally, asking questions and receiving thoughtful responses from the older man. Finally, they reached some kind of agreement that Running Deer translated for Sarah. White Eagle says the spirits have spoken to him in dreams about your purpose among our people. He believes you were sent to help heal the wounds between our races, but the path to such healing leads through great danger and sacrifice. What kind of sacrifice? Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. You would have to give up all hope of returning to your old life. The soldiers would never trust a woman who negotiated for Comanche prisoners to simply resume her place in white society. You would become an outcast from both worlds, belonging fully to neither. The magnitude of such a choice overwhelmed Sarah's ability to process it rationally. She would be sacrificing not only her marriage to Thomas, but also any hope of acceptance in the civilization she had been born into. The loneliness of such existence seemed almost unbearable to contemplate. Yet the alternative was to abandon people who had become dear to her in their hour of greatest need. The faces of captured children haunted her imagination, along with the knowledge that her original capture had contributed to their current suffering. How could she live with herself if she chose personal safety over their welfare? I need time to think about this, Sarah said finally. Time is not something we have in abundance, Kicking Bear replied. The longer the prisoners remain in military custody, the harder it will become to negotiate their release. If they are moved to a reservation or sent to schools in the East, they may be lost to their families forever. That night, Sarah lay awake listening to the waterfall and thinking about the impossible choice before her. In her mind, she could see Thomas searching for her, refusing to give up hope despite the passing months. The image of his face filled with joy at their reunion, warred with the vision of captured Comanche children crying for mothers they might never see again. By morning, her decision was made. She would attempt to reach the military fort and negotiate for the prisoner's release, knowing that such action would likely end any chance of returning to her former life. The sacrifice seemed enormous, but the alternative of living with such guilt seemed even worse. Kicking Bear accepted her choice with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. You have the heart of a true warrior, he told her. But remember that some battles cannot be won, no matter how bravely they are fought. Do not destroy yourself trying to achieve the impossible. They prepared to leave the cave that had sheltered them, setting out on a journey that would take them toward the military fort and an uncertain confrontation with representatives of Sarah's own people. As they rode away from the waterfall, Sarah felt as though she was leaving behind her last connection to the safety and innocence of her former life. The path ahead led through dangerous territory controlled by hostile forces, toward a destination where her reception would likely range from suspicious to openly hostile. Yet Sarah felt a strange sense of peace about her decision, as though she was finally moving in harmony with forces larger than her own desires and fears. Running Deer rode beside her, offering silent support and companionship as they began the most dangerous journey of Sarah's life. Behind them, White Eagle chanted softly in Comanche, perhaps calling on spiritual protection for the mission ahead, and leading them all, Kicking Bear maintained the alert vigilance of a warrior entering enemy territory, ready to protect his small band against whatever threats they might encounter. Fort McKinney appeared on the horizon like a brown scar against the green prairie grass. Sarah's heart raced as she saw the American flag flying above wooden walls that represented both salvation and condemnation. Inside those walls were the captured Comanche prisoners she hoped to help, but also soldiers who might consider her a traitor to her own race. The small group halted on a ridge, overlooking the fort while Kicking Bear studied the layout. Through field glasses taken from a fallen cavalry officer weeks earlier, Sarah could see sentries patrolling the walls and smoke rising from cooking fires within the compound. The sight of civilization after months in the wilderness should have filled her with joy, but instead she felt only anxiety about the confrontation ahead. There, Kicking Bear pointed to a cluster of tents outside the main fort walls. The prisoners are being held in that area. I count at least 20 guards surrounding the camp. Sarah squinted against the afternoon sun, trying to make out individual figures among the distant tents. Were Singing Bird and the children somewhere in that cluster of canvas shelters, wondering if anyone would come to help them? The thought strengthened her resolve to attempt what others might consider a hopeless mission. "How do we approach without being shot?" Sarah asked through Running Deer's translation. "You will go alone," Kicking Bear replied grimly. "A white woman approaching under a flag of truce will receive different treatment than armed Comanche warriors. We will wait here and watch for your signal." The plan was simple but dangerous. Sarah would ride to the fort gates and request a meeting with the commanding officer, claiming to be an escaped captive seeking to negotiate for the release of other prisoners. If successful, she would signal the others to approach for the actual exchange. If the meeting went badly, they would flee and try to find another way to help their people. Sarah changed into the white dress she had been wearing when captured, which Running Deer had carefully preserved despite their nomadic travels. The familiar fabric felt strange against skin now tanned by months of outdoor living, and the tight-fitting bodice seemed restrictive after wearing loose native clothing. As she prepared to leave, Kicking Bear approached with a small leather pouch containing personal items that might serve as proof of her story. "These belonged to soldiers killed in the recent battle," he explained. "Show them to your people as evidence that you have lived among us and understand our ways." The moment of departure felt heavier than Sarah had anticipated. Running Deer embraced her like a sister, whispering words of encouragement in both English and Comanche. White Eagle offered a brief blessing that Sarah hoped would provide spiritual protection for the dangerous mission ahead. Kicking Bear's farewell was more complex, mixing gratitude with something deeper that neither of them had acknowledged during their months together. "If you succeed in freeing our people, you will have honored the memory of my wife better than any revenge could have done," he said quietly. Sarah rode toward the fort alone, carrying a white cloth tied to a long stick as a flag of truce. The distance that had seemed short from the ridge stretched endlessly as her horse plodded across the open ground, between safety and uncertainty. Every step took her closer to a confrontation that would determine not only her own fate but also the future of the people she had come to love. Guards on the fort walls spotted her approach and began shouting to their companions inside the compound. Sarah could see rifle barrels tracking her movement as she drew closer, and she fought the urge to turn and flee back to the hills where Kicking Bear waited with the others. "Halt! State your business," a sergeant called out as Sarah reached speaking distance of the main gate. "My name is Sarah Mitchell," she replied, surprised by how strange her own name sounded after months of being called by Comanche terms of address. "I was captured by the Comanche 3 months ago and have escaped to seek help for other prisoners being held in your camp." The gates opened after several minutes of shouted conversations between guards and unseen officers inside the fort. Sarah was escorted through dusty parade grounds toward a wooden building that served as headquarters. Soldiers stared openly at her sun-darkened skin and the mixture of white and native clothing she wore, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. Colonel James Hartford emerged from the headquarters building as Sarah approached. He was a tall man with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested years of frontier service. His uniform was clean but worn, and his manner carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much conflict between settlers and natives. "Mrs. Mitchell, I presume," Hartford said, studying her appearance carefully. "We received word from your husband that you had been taken. He's been searching for you with every available man for months." Sarah's heart clenched at the mention of Thomas. Is my husband well?" "Alive, but consumed with finding you. He's currently leading a patrol in the Eastern Territories, following reports of Comanche activity near the Colorado border." Hartford gestured toward his office. "Please come inside. You have quite a story to tell, I'm sure." Inside the sparse military office, Sarah found herself facing questions that required careful answers. Hartford was clearly intelligent and experienced in dealing with both settlers and natives. He would not be easily deceived by a simple story of escape and rescue. "How did you manage to get away from your captors?" Hartford asked, pouring her a cup of coffee that tasted like heaven after months without it. "They trusted me," Sarah replied honestly. "I learned their language and their ways. When the opportunity came, I was able to slip away during the confusion of breaking camp. And yet you come here seeking to help other Comanche prisoners rather than simply rejoicing in your freedom. That seems unusual for someone who has suffered months of captivity." Sarah had prepared for this question, but delivering her answer still required careful courage. "Colonel, during my time with the tribe, I witnessed things that changed my understanding of this conflict. Yes, I was taken against my will, but I was also protected and cared for by people who showed me kindness despite having every reason to hate my race." Hartford's expression hardened slightly. "Mrs. Mitchell, I hope you're not suggesting that we should show mercy to savages who raid settlements and murder innocent families. I'm suggesting that some of your prisoners are innocent families themselves," Sarah replied firmly. "There are children in your camp who have done nothing but be born to the wrong parents at the wrong time in history." The colonel studied her for a long moment, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. Finally, he spoke with the tone of a man who had made difficult decisions many times before. "What exactly are you proposing?" "An exchange. I have information about Comanche movements and camps that would be valuable to your operations. In return, I ask that you release the women and children you captured, keeping only the warriors who actually fought against your soldiers." "And what guarantee do I have that this information is accurate?" "How do I know you haven't been turned by your captors and sent here to deceive us?" Sarah reached into the leather pouch Kicking Bear had given her and withdrew several items taken from fallen soldiers. "These belong to men who died in the recent battle. I can tell you exactly how each man fell and where his body lies. I can also tell you which camps are planning to move south for the winter and which trails they will use." Hartford examined the personal effects with growing interest. Among them were a watch, a letter from home, and a distinctive belt buckle that he apparently recognized. "Sergeant Morrison's buckle," he said quietly. "We wondered what happened to his patrol. They fought bravely," Sarah said truthfully, "but they were outnumbered and caught in unfavorable terrain. I can show you the location if you agree to my terms." The negotiation continued for hours as Sarah provided details about Comanche movements and strategies while carefully avoiding information that might endanger Kicking Bear and the others waiting in the hills. Hartford asked probing questions designed to test her honesty and knowledge, gradually becoming convinced that her intelligence was both genuine and valuable. As evening approached, they reached an agreement. Sarah would provide detailed maps and information about tribal movements in exchange for the release of 12 women and children from the prisoner camp. The warriors would remain in custody to face military justice, but the non-combatants would be freed to return to their people. "There is one condition," Hartford added as they finalized the arrangement. "You must remain here until we can verify your information. If any of it proves false, the deal is void and you will face charges as a collaborator." Sarah agreed, knowing that this restriction would prevent her from rejoining Kicking Bear and the others immediately. But the sight of Comanche children being reunited with their families seemed worth any personal sacrifice required to achieve it. That night, as she lay on a real bed for the first time in months, Sarah heard voices calling her name from the darkness outside the fort. Through her window, she could see signal fires burning on the distant hills where Kicking Bear waited for news of her mission. She lit a lamp and placed it in her window, then extinguished it 3 times, the agreed signal that negotiations had been successful. The exchange took place the following morning in the open ground between the fort and the hills. Sarah watched from the walls as 12 Comanche women and children walked slowly toward freedom, many of them crying with relief and joy. In the distance, she could see Kicking Bear and the others waiting to receive their loved ones. As the last of the released prisoners disappeared into the hills, Sarah felt a profound sense of completion mixed with loss. She had succeeded in her mission, but at the cost of any chance to return to the life she had once known. Colonel Hartford had made it clear that her actions, while honorable, had marked her as someone who could never again be fully trusted by either side in the ongoing conflict. Thomas would eventually learn of her survival and her choices. Whether he could forgive her decision to prioritize Comanche lives over their reunion remained to be seen. But as Sarah watched the morning sun rise over the endless prairie, she felt at peace with the path she had chosen, knowing that some bridges between worlds could only be built by those willing to sacrifice their place in both.